Chapter 59. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps my motivation to continue writing this story. Chapter 59. Peter, oh my God, Ned exclaimed as soon as he saw Peter walk into the hotel lobby from the grand front doors. There was an edge of panic to his longest friend's voice as he rushed forward to greet him, and Peter actually felt guilt prick at his subconscious for not thinking to check in on Ned earlier. For him and Betty to be trapped and helpless when up so close to the fire elemental? How was Ned not having a full-blown panic attack right now? But it seemed that Ned was leading up to that point as his breathing started to hyperventilate with shallow rasping breaths. Hey, Peter tried to soothe, his hands raised in the air in the universal sign of appeasement. Hey. We almost died. Breathe here with me, Ned, all right? Peter gripped the sides of Ned's large shoulders as he coaxed in a calm tone of voice and went along with the motions of inhaling a deep breath of oxygen that Ned immediately mimicked. Now let it out slowly, that's it. Measurably, his friend came back down to a semblance of calm. You all right now? Peter asked him, his voice cautious as he looked at Ned warily. Ned nodded, but his forehead still had a lingering residue of cold sweat. Come here, Peter said worriedly as he pulled his friend into a hug, holding the other boy up on solid feet as he rocked a bit unsteadily. I was so scared, Peter, Ned mumbled before they both pulled back from the embrace. I thought for sure that we were goners. If it wasn't for Mysterio. Trailing off, Ned's whole body shuddered just from the thought of the monster getting his fiery clutches on him and Betty, burning them alive in the process. What happened, man? Peter couldn't help but ask. I thought that you were going to keep everyone away from the center of the festival, including yourself? Peter was trying to be understanding without his voice coming across as accusatory. Ned has been through enough tonight, but Ned wasn't supposed to be anywhere near the fight to begin with. That was what they had all agreed upon just yesterday. Ned swallowed and his face shifted to look sheepish and guilty. Everyone split up and I panicked. Betty really insisted on riding the Ferris wheel and I couldn't let her go alone. I thought that maybe we could just do the one quick ride and then I could get her out of there. I thought we had more time. Sighing, Peter accepted his friend's excuse. Ned had never been one to be able to think of believable lies, especially when it came to protecting Peter's secret. Nor was Ned the assertive type that put his foot down whenever someone tried to plow over him. And Betty could be a force of nature. Well, everything's fine now, Peter reassured as he made a show of shrugging his shoulders, making sure to tell Ned without words that he wasn't mad or even remotely upset. He was just glad that they were all right and that all of this elemental business was well and truly behind him. Now, he could have as much uninterrupted time with Mary Jane as he wanted. The thought made him smile slightly as he said, Hey, guess what? I'm done with the mission. The confirmation that the monster was for sure dead caused Ned's shoulders to droop with relief. Peter couldn't blame him, knowing that he himself also felt the same way. Mysterio had sent that beast back into the pits of hell where it belonged, and Peter would forever be eternally grateful to him for it. Well, everyone's itching to leave after that monster attack, Ned finally said. Harry's setting up the private jet to leave tomorrow morning for London and a figure suddenly came upon them and Ned cut himself off. Michelle stood there, looming just a few feet away from them in a flowery skirt and a jean jacket as she stared at Peter with what looked to be determination shining in her eyes. And without wasting a beat, she pushed out in a rather rushed tone, Peter, can we talk? Brows furrowing, Peter could only frown at her. Talk? What exactly was there that needed to be said between them? The longest conversation they've ever had probably only lasted 5 minutes tops, which was probably when they were both on the decathlon team together. But beyond that, he didn't want to linger downstairs for much longer. He was itching to get upstairs to see Mary Jane, to let her know that he was all right. She was probably so worried right now. So, naturally, Peter hesitated. His reluctance must have been palpable on his face because Michelle's expression softened as she looked into his eyes imploringly. It's important, she stressed. Frowning further, Peter weighed his options. Mary Jane's lovely face was swarming in his thoughts. But if Michelle said that it was important, perhaps a few minutes longer wouldn't hurt. Uncle Ben's words about responsibility floated around in his mind, which helped to make his decision for him. Sure. Shoulders sagging, Michelle flashed him the smallest of smiles in gratitude and nodded once to him. It was such an odd sight for him to see, her smiling at him. And not in her normally sardonic way, Either. Ignoring the odd nature of their interaction for now, Peter turned to Ned and they clapped hands together. I'm glad you're okay, man. Yeah. I'll come find you later. See you before we leave for London, Ned told him, looking between Peter and Michelle with confusion puckering his brows. Nodding, Peter then turned to the normally dour girl, perplexed at seeing her act almost jittery. It was so far out of the scope of how he usually saw her acting, that for a time, Peter was stunned into silence as he followed her while they wandered out of the hotel and walked a little ways until they made it to the Charles Bridge. Only when they made it that far in complete silence, did Peter's self-awareness finally catch up to him again as he realized they hadn't exchanged a single word since leaving the hotel. So, Peter began, clearing his throat uncomfortably as they slowly traversed the cobblestone brick, what did you want to, know that they used to execute people on this bridge? Michelle interrupted him suddenly, as a trembling hand came up to tuck her loose curls behind her ear. Then, she twisted her lips at herself before she shot a quick look at Peter out of the corner of her eye. Her hands came down near her abdomen to wind her fingers together in complicated knots. They would, put them in a basket and they would drown in the water. It was with ever-mounting perplexion that grew inside of him while he soaked in this random tidbit of information. Peter gave her a strange look out of the corner of his eye. That was what you brought him out here to tell him? Normally Peter was all about random facts, but he wasn't really in the mood for exchanging trivia when he could be spending this moment in the arms of the girl that he loved. But then a thought struck him as Peter considered her. No. She was stalling. But he thought that what she had to tell him was important? If that was the case, then why hadn't she blurted it out already? Was time not of the essence? Michelle hesitated again, seeing the confused expression on his features. Sorry. It's fine. But, a stray thought suddenly popped into his mind. Was this about Harry? At the thought of his best friend, the image of Harry's face came into mind, as he gave moon eyes to Michelle as they sat together at the pool the other night. Was Michelle wanting to talk to Peter about Harry to try and scope out the situation with him? Peter didn't see that as the same level of important information that Michelle obviously did if that were the case. But then again, maybe Michelle thought that this would be her last chance to talk to Peter about Harry before they parted ways, with Michelle going with Harry and everyone else to London, while Peter and Mary Jane would fly home to New York. Well, if she wanted to know about Harry, then there was only one way to find out, especially since it seemed that she wasn't all that willing to bring the subject matter up. Hey, I want to ask you something. She stopped walking as she turned to face him, her eyes lit up slightly. Why, yeah? Was she glad that Peter was going to be the one to bring up the elephant in the room, the one and only illustrious Harry Osborn? Yeah, Peter confirmed before he took in a deep breath. This was going to be so uncomfortable, but he honestly owed Harry after all he had done to help Peter get with Mary Jane. This was Peter's chance to pay him back for being such a great friend. Inhaling deeply, Peter then said, So, I know this may be awkward hearing me say this. But Michelle, you're Spider-Man. Everything within Peter froze as he staggered back a step. What? That's what you were going to say. Her tone of voice sounded so self-assured and confident, that you're Spider-Man. It took a second for his brain to catch up, and when it finally did, it was as though a blaring alarm was going off in his mind that flashed a red warning sign. The sound of his heartbeat could be heard in his ears. Peter resolutely shook his head. No. I'm not Spider-Man. He tried to come across as firm, but also blasé. To make it seem like it was no big deal, but even as the words came out, there was a slight cracking to his tone, something that he knew for sure Michelle heard judging by the slight smirk that tickled her lips. I mean, I've been watching you for a while now. It's kind of obvious. I'm not Spider-Man, Peter tried to press again, resolute in his absolute denial. This was a fucking nightmare. What makes you think I'm Spider-Man? Michelle gave him a deadpan look. Peter Washington? Yeah? What about it? He shot back, somewhat defensive as he crossed his arms over his chest. The fact that you, disappear out of nowhere for no reason? No, that was I was sick. Remember? I had the tummy. And then there's the fact that you're conveniently in Prague at the same time Spider-Man is? More than one American is allowed in the same city, Michelle. Peter practically exclaimed in his erratic tone of voice, his arms uncrossed as they threw themselves up in the air. Then, what about tonight? Michelle accused, you snuck off and fought that thing. I saw you. You can't have seen me because I'm not Spider-Man. Peter's hands were really getting more animated the longer they talked, no matter how much it portrayed his distinct lack of calm, but he couldn't help it. It's kinda ridiculous that we're even having this conversation. Michelle raised that infamous sardonic brow at him before she shook her head at him. Okay, she hummed, still not looking as though she believed him as she turned and dug in her messenger bag that was slung over her shoulder before finally producing an object. And what do you have to say about this? Whipping out a boxy object from her bag, she held it out for his inspection, displaying clearly that it had webbing stuck to it. She was watching him closely for his reaction, trying to look for any tells or signs of familiarity in his gaze. But she didn't get much of one from him because he wasn't exactly sure what the object in her hands actually was, so his confusion was genuine as he tried to peer closer without actually taking any active steps closer. And it was as he was doing so, where he saw out of his peripheral vision just how closely Michelle was watching him, like a hawk zeroing in on its prey, and realization suddenly dawned on him. All of her strange behavior these past years. All of the staring. The snide comments. Was that why you were always watching me? Peter couldn't help but ask as his gaze lifted speculatively to meet with Michelle's, the pieces of the puzzle suddenly coming together in his mind, because you thought I was Spider-Man? Michelle immediately lowered her gaze, her hands playing with the object within her grasp as she turned it over repeatedly in her hands. Then she looked up, a beat delayed. Why yeah. Why else would I be watching you? Peter looked at her closely, trying to get a read on her. There was something else there. Something hidden underneath the surface that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Something that Michelle wasn't saying or admitting to. Are you sure? A surge of light suddenly burst from the object within Michelle's fiddling hands, which was immediately dropped as though it had burned her. The sky was overwhelmed by a dark bustling storm of a cloud that had a severe face etched in the middle of crackling bolts of lightning. An arm came out from the fog as it made a threatening sweep at Peter and Michelle's defenseless forms. There was no warning from his spider sense, so there was no instinctual urge for him to dodge out of the way. Though it ended up being a non-issue, as the arm went right through them, as though it were nothing more than the arm of a ghost. In the very next moment, the freak storm in the sky disappeared with a flicker, leaving the still and calm night that they had walked out into. What the hell was that? Peter asked to no one in particular as he whipped his head and body around simultaneously, manically searching for the cloud that had suddenly dissipated like. Well, mist. Michelle was looking upward and around too, just as perplexed as Peter. I don't know. Then, her gaze caught onto the object that she just dropped. It was sparking slightly with crackling light. She looked to be wanting to step forward and grab it again, so Peter held out both of his hands as a warning of caution as he tentatively took measured steps forward before picking up the object himself. What is it? Michelle asked, her voice bordering on scared as Peter brought the object closer to his eyes for inspection, studying the tech beyond the stickiness of his web, like as some kind of projector or something. Yeah, but it's really advanced, Peter confirmed, his interest getting piqued as a part of him couldn't hold back the awe he felt from marveling at the technology he held in his hands. It looked so real, Michelle stressed with a stutter as Peter frowned to himself in thought as he finally looked up from the projector in his hands, staring out into the distance at nothing. Yeah. Really real. His mind was bustling, going over the memory of what he just saw coming out of the projector. It looked like a cloud, a swarming gust of wind, only it had a face. It suddenly clicked in his brain exactly what it was that they had seen. The face. The dark, bustling cloud. The swiping arm. It was the air elemental. Wait a minute, does that mean that the elementals are fake? Peter couldn't help but ask aloud, flabbergasted as he blinked rapidly against his own reasoning. That doesn't make any sense. Because we were there, right? There was fire and destruction and... Peter trailed off, trying to make sense of it all in his mind. With illusion tech like the projector he had currently in his hand, all one had to do was strap it onto a bunch of drones that would be able to airstrike and mimic the destructive results of the fire elemental as it smashed and burned down the surrounding structures. Who would do something like that? The first culprit that came to mind was Nick Fury. That perhaps he orchestrated this entire thing simply because he wanted Spider-Man under his thumb to manipulate and control for his new Avengers coalition. It made sense. Fury would have access to the high-tech equipment that Peter currently held within his hands. Perhaps he even pawned it off of Mr. Stark after he died. But that theory was wiped clean not even a moment later. As Peter's thumb must have hit a button or something on the projector in his hands, because in the very next second, the monstrous wind figure was back swarming above their heads. But the air elemental wasn't alone this time, because flying around and attacking the beast with green mist was a figure with a globe helmet covering his face. Mysterio, Michelle breathed, just as stunned as Peter felt. It was like a punch to the gut. In a whoosh, all of the air left his lungs as he stared, horrified at the illusion of Mysterio as it fought the air elemental so valiantly, complete with grunts and war cries as they monster roared with pain. It was evident that Peter was in shock, being only capable of staring dumbly at the coordinated scene in front of his very eyes that looked so damn real. But as the shock began to wane, betrayal, so bitter on his tongue, weighed heavily at the back of his throat as it simultaneously cut so deep, roiled through his body, originating in his chest. And it hurt. It hurt so badly. He wanted to keel over right where he stood and sob as the implications hit him like a freight train. Quentin Beck was never his ally. Hell, he had never even been his friend. He had been using Peter, manipulating him. And Peter had stupidly put all of his faith in him, desperately needing to grasp onto a new mentor figure in his life, needing guidance from the void that Mr. Stark had left gaping open when he had died. And Beck. He took advantage of that vulnerability within Peter, all while he was still trying to grieve. Bile rose up his throat. The man was, in actuality, a complete stranger to him. But to what gain, though? What purpose would Quentin Beck have to feel the need to exploit a 16-year-old kid from Queens? Was it simply for shits and giggles? To see if he could get away with it? Or was it more nefarious than that? What if was it because Peter perhaps had something that Beck wanted? Was it his spider suit, decked out with so much Stark tech? Insight on Thanos? Stark Industries secrets? Or the blood suddenly drained from his face. Edith. Quentin Beck had been after Edith. Just so he could have access to all of the drones to attach more illusion tech to. And Peter had just willingly handed them over. Eyes ever widening at what he had just done, Peter whirled around quickly to face Michelle, panic clawing at his chest in a tight, cold grasp, so much that he couldn't contain his fears. He needed to vocalize them. "I'm Spider-Man," Peter confirmed, followed by a nervous swallow, "and I really messed up." It took a second to get any sort of response from her before her jaw dropped open slightly at his sudden admission to the truth. "Wait," Michelle blinked rapidly at the rapid onslaught of honesty, "you're being serious right now?" Peter hummed nervously, almost feeling like he was going to puke as he smashed his lips together against the spew that threatened to retch from his uneasy stomach. "You're not joking with me?" Mish felt the need to reiterate with a pointed look that was begging for reassurance, "You're being 100% serious? Because it's not funny." Peter resolutely shook his head. "No. I'm not joking. See, 'cause I was only like 67% sure, Michelle. So why are you here? Why are you in Prague?" Michelle," Peter cried, trying to garner the girl's attention. His panic had now reached new heights as he thought about Mary Jane. Beck knew about his girlfriend and what lengths he would go to in order to protect her. She could be in danger. "I know you have a lot of questions. But look, we really have to get out of here, okay? I have to find Mary Jane." Okay. Michelle nodded as Peter turned and started to run back up the bridge toward the hotel, before she excitedly exclaimed, "I can't believe I figured it out." Rushing back through the grand front doors of the hotel, Peter pushed his way through them and into the lobby, projector still firmly in hand with Michelle hot on his heels. They were halfway to the elevators when Peter spotted him. Brad Davis. The other boy seemed to be waiting for something as he leaned against the wall near the elevators. And as soon as Brad looked up and connected gazes with Peter, he knew that Brad had stationed himself in order to wait for him. As they got closer, Brad pushed himself off of the wall and approached Peter with a stormy look in his eyes. Brad made a grab for Peter's arm, but Peter easily sidestepped him with a level glare. But Brad didn't let that deter him as he pointed an accusing finger at Peter. "I can't believe that you just left her, man." "What are you talking about?" Peter scoffed as he went to try and bypass Brad, but the other boy stubbornly stepped sideways to block Peter's path. Peter's fingers clenched into tight fists by his sides at Brad's audacity. Peter threw his arms up in frustration as he said, "I don't have time for. You just left Mary Jane out there all on her own." Brad seethed at him, getting close into Peter's personal space as he towered over him with his few inches of height. It was clear that he was trying to be intimidating, but Peter was far from feeling the effects of it. Instead, he made another attempt to peacefully sidestep him, but Brad maneuvered his body once again. "She was lucky that I came around to walk her back to the hotel." This caused for Peter to pause in his attempt to get to the elevators. Brad was part of the reason why the group split up, according to Ned, after Peter and Mary Jane left for their alone time together at the festival? And it was all because he was trailing them, spying on them. "Are you seriously admitting to having followed us?" Peter asked, his voice accusatory as he stared at the other boy in disbelief and mounting anger. His body started shaking from the effects he felt from his blood boiling. "What a fucking creep." "I had a bad feeling about you," Brad said with narrowed eyes down at Peter, "so I'm glad that I did." In a snap decision, Peter shoved the projector into Michelle's open hands before he reached forward and balled his hands around the fabric of Brad's shirt, shoving him forward as he pushed him up against the wall, holding him there. "Peter," Michelle exclaimed as she rushed forward to tug at Peter's unmovable arm. But Peter ignored her, instead giving his entire focus on the prick in front of him. "I'm only going to say this once," Peter began, his voice low and steady. "Dangerous, leave my girlfriend alone. She's not interested and she's already been through a lot. So, leave her in peace." Brad struggled against Peter's ironclad hold, but Peter wasn't going to let go just yet. Not until they came to some sort of understanding. Mary Jane shouldn't have to deal with this type of bullshit, especially since she was still recovering both physically and mentally from her traumatizing ordeal. But Brad didn't seem to grasp the bigger picture here as he jutted out his chin stubbornly as he spat out, "Kinda like how you left her alone on the streets in a foreign country?" Releasing her hold on Peter's arm, Michelle stepped back with a scoff as she crossed her arms. "Are you trying to imply that she's not capable?" Eyes widening, Brad shifted his hate-filled gaze over to Michelle, who raised that infamous sardonic brow at him, fully expecting an answer to her very valid question. I mean, because that's what it sounds like you're saying," Michelle said, a dry and accusing lilt to her voice as she leveled Brad with a stare. "You think that girls can't take care of themselves, Davis?" Sputtering, Brad resolutely shook his head with his denial. "That's not what I said at all. She was just kidnapped, so maybe she just needs someone to look out for her so that it doesn't happen again." Teeth clenching, Peter forced himself to count to 10 in his head. Because it was obvious that Brad Davis didn't see Mary Jane clearly at all. Not only had Mary Jane managed to escape her captivity on her own, but she was only recaptured when the surgically enhanced Hammerhead had to intervene in order to do so. Without him, Mary Jane would have found her own way to freedom. Peter had witnessed the video footage himself. And she had been so close. Not only did Mary Jane save Peter's life upon first meeting him as Spider-Man, but she also saved his life again when she dragged his unconscious body out of the blazing fire the night of Harry's disastrous party. Not only did she have every right to crumble and fall apart at the seams after living a life with her neglectful parents, her alcoholic father, as well as her survival of traumatic events such as the bomb at the charity ball and her latest kidnapping, but she stood resolutely strong in the face of it all. And not only that, but she remained the loving, upbeat and lively girl that he loved. Mary Jane Watson was the strongest and most capable person that he knew. And it was precisely one of the reasons why he was in love with her. "See, you say that wasn't what you were saying," Michelle continued to berate Brad while Peter was struggling internally to get a grasp on his tenuous control. Because how fucking dare he see Mary Jane as weak when she was so far from it. "But then you immediately double down, Davis. Which is it? Is she capable or not?" "Yeah," Peter chimed in, needing to say his piece. "Mary Jane didn't get kidnapped because she wasn't careful. She was set up." It suddenly hit him how much of a colossal waste of time this was. Judging by the look on Brad's face, he still wasn't grasping onto what they were saying. Peter doubted that he ever would. Mary Jane was right. Brad was the sort of guy that didn't care about the mind of the girl so long as it was covered by a pretty face. Disgust roiled in Peter's gut. Letting go of his hold on Brad, Peter forced himself to take a step back. "I seriously don't have time for this." What was important now was getting to Mary Jane and warning her about Beck. They needed to come up with a game plan to ensure that Quentin didn't get his sadistic hands on her. Brad took a step forward now that he was free, attempting to stop Peter again, but Peter was no longer deterred, nor was he feeling particularly gracious anymore. He harshly clipped his shoulder with Brad's as he stepped past him, and Brad let out a hiss at the impact. No doubt would it leave a bruise. As he made his way to the elevators, Peter could sense that Michelle was following behind him. It took several seconds, enough for Peter to press the call button for the lift, but of course Brad would want to have the last word. "I find it very interesting that the two of you came from outside the hotel alone together," Brad called to Peter's back. "I wonder how Mary Jane will feel about it?" Teeth clenching tight, Peter didn't want to give him the satisfaction of any sort of response, so he ignored him. The elevator doors opened then, and he and Michelle stepped quickly into the available lift as Peter pressed the button to ensure that the doors closed quickly. As soon as Peter opened the door to their hotel room, it was to see Mary Jane sitting on the couch that faced directly parallel with the door, with her knee bouncing anxiously while she waited. As soon as she processed his presence, and no doubt saw with her own eyes that he was, in fact, alive, she let out a gasp as a beaming grin overtook her beautiful features. Moving faster than he had seen her move since she incurred the muscular deficiency to her legs, she shot to her feet and stumbled his way. Peter took a few steps toward her, but she was upon him quicker than he was to her as she threw her arms around his neck, burying her face against his shoulder. "You're okay." Peter inhaled her scent as he clutched her to him, the flowery essence of it setting a level of calm in his chest. It reassured him that she was all right. That she was here, real. Not an illusion. There was no way that Beck could fake the way that her silky smooth skin felt against his own. "Yeah," Peter hummed as he allowed himself to indulge for just a moment longer, turning to press a kiss on the side of her head, before he forced himself to pull back in order to tell her everything. Turns out the monster wasn't a threat after all. "We've got other problems." Evident confusion plagued her exuberant expression as her lips downturned into a frown. "What do you mean?" But Mary Jane never finished her sentence, because she cut herself off as soon as she saw Michelle lingering awkwardly in the open doorway behind Peter. Immediately Mary Jane smoothed her features as she directed a teasing smile his way. "Tiger, I see that you weren't able to get that ice cream that I sent you out to get me." Ah. She was trying to protect him. His heart swelled just from how readily she went out of her way to guard his secret like that. God, she was amazing. "Mary Jane," Peter interrupted before she had to stress herself with the attempt any further. He stepped around her and made a beeline for the open windows, immediately forcing the drapes shut. Beck could be spying on them with a drone at that very moment. They couldn't risk exposure if it could be helped. Then, he turned to face the room, only to find Mary Jane giving him a perplexed look at his bizarre behavior, all while shifting an uneasy gaze toward Michelle, who took a couple of steps into the room. Peter gestured toward the other girl and said, "It's fine. Michelle knows." Eyes snapping back to connect with his, Mary Jane furrowed her brows. "She knows?" Peter nodded. "She knows that I'm Spider-Man." Mary Jane blinked rapidly as she staggered back a step. How?" With one hand uncomfortably coming up to knot at the back of his hair, Peter sighed and shrugged one shoulder. "She figured it out." Frowning further, Mary Jane said, "And you didn't deny it?" The hand in his hair dropped so that it was now cradling the back of his neck, as he worked at the tense muscles there. "I tried, but then she showed me this projector." He gestured toward Michelle, who lifted it for Mary Jane's inspection. "Mysterio is a fraud, Red," Peter began, and Mary Jane's head whipped in his direction so quickly that he feared that she had given herself whiplash. Peter swallowed, emotion suddenly getting to him. He could hardly believe it himself, but it was the truth. Quentin Beck had played him like a fool. But the most heartbreaking part of it was the utter disappointment that Peter felt at feeling like he lost, not only an ally, but a friend. It was difficult for Peter to admit to his failures to the girl that he loved, not wanting to be seen as incompetent, or as a fool, or weak. But it would be a disservice to Mary Jane if he didn't tell her the whole truth in its entirety. They had agreed to no longer keep secrets. Peter only made one exception for that rule. And that was regarding the true extent of his feelings for her. So, Peter disclosed everything, every detail. How the fight supposedly went. How Beck made it seem as though Mysterio saved the day, and how Peter fell for it hook, line, and sinker. How Beck somehow convinced Peter to unwind in a bar afterward where he had expertly manipulated Peter's emotions and played him like a fiddle. How Peter idiotically handed over Edith, the very last thing that Mr. Stark had gifted to him that Peter had stupidly thrown away. How Michelle stopped him in the hotel lobby when he had been on his way upstairs to see him and confronted him about being Spider-Man. How he had at first denied it, but then she produced a projector with webbing on it, and how he now remembered when during the battle against the fire elemental, his webbing at one point had bounced off of something invisible before ricocheting into the distance. How Michelle found that piece of debris that turned out to be a projector. How they figured out that the elementals were fake and that Mysterio was behind it all. All of this before they made their way back here so that Peter could find her. "I really messed up bad this time, Red," Peter said as his hands came up to rub at his eyes, hiding his face from her in his shame. He now has full access to Mr. Stark's glasses. And there is so much that he can do with that access now. "So what's your plan?" she asked him, and Peter let his hand fall away as he focused his gaze on the floor, formulating the best course that they should take. "I have to talk to Fury, but Beck probably tapped my phone when he put his number in." Peter mused as he took out the cellular device from his pocket and peered at it suspiciously. Dread coursed through his veins as he knew exactly what needed to be done. So much for his freedom in returning to New York. Lifting his head, he met Mary Jane's wide-eyed stare head-on. "I'm going to Berlin to warn Fury." "And you?" This was probably the most difficult part of his decision. "You're going to go to London with everyone else." A gasp escaped her as her eyes widened. Immediately she was shaking her head in denial. "Why no? Tiger. You have to, Red," Peter stressed as he took the measured steps needed to get close to her again. Once he was near, he gathered both of her hands in his and squeezed them gently, his gaze imploring all the while, willing her to understand. "He knows how much I care about you. You need to go to a place where he wouldn't be able to find you easily and get to you. Which means that you can't go back to New York either." It pained him to be telling her this. The very last thing that he wanted was to be separated from her, not after they only just reunited not even a week ago. He hadn't been lying when he told her that he was hesitant to leave her side before, and that was more due to the fact that he simply just felt the need to be close to her after spending so much time thinking that she had been lost to him forever. But it was a necessity that they got their separate ways. Not only for her safety, but for Peter's mental security as well. Beck has more than proved that he wasn't past fighting dirty and getting Peter's personal life involved in his twisted game. "But how will we explain me going to London without you all of a sudden?" Mary Jane couldn't help but ask. It was clear that she was grasping at straws, trying to find a logical hole in his plan so that they wouldn't have to follow through with it. Perhaps she hoped that he would let her come with the Berlin. Or perhaps she was hoping that Peter would forget all of this and risk calling Fury instead. All of it was very tempting, but it wouldn't be the responsible thing to do. And he has done enough damage on that front tonight to last him a lifetime. He knew, without a doubt, that Peter would look back at this night periodically and cringe at his irresponsible actions by putting his blind faith in the wrong man. But it would be less so if he somehow managed to make everything right. "I can help cover," Michelle piped up, and for a second, Peter had honestly forgotten that she was in the room. He had been too focused on his inner turmoil regarding Beck and leaving Mary Jane. As he looked over at the door girl, she shrugged one shoulder at him. "We'll have to keep the explanation simple." Mary Jane seemed to consider this before her eyes widened, and she shot her gaze to connect with Peter's. "We'll just say that I found out my dad is in London and I'm going to see him. But Peter couldn't come because he still has to go back home to help May." It was clear to Peter how much it pained Mary Jane to be complicit in this plan, enough to be fine-tuning the details of it. But Peter frowned at the mention of her father, not liking the idea of involving Molten Man when he still didn't trust the man with Mary Jane's safety. And with Peter out of the way and in Berlin, he could very easily decide to take her and hide her away somewhere like he had planned over 5 years ago. Still, Peter didn't want to outright shoot down her idea, at least not with the passionate dislike that he was feeling inside. No, he wanted to be supportive in a way. This was still her dad, so instead, he responded in a soft voice, "Are you sure you should be seeing your dad again without me there?" She smiled wanly at him. "It will all be a front, Tiger. Michelle already said that she'll cover for me. She'll just tell the group that she saw me leave to go meet up with him, but in reality, I'll just be hiding in my room at Harry's townhouse." The breath of relief releasing from his lungs couldn't be helped. A part of him wanted to believe that Mark Watson had changed for the better, but he wasn't ready to put that to the test when he couldn't be nearby to prevent anything untoward from happening. Good, Peter sighed as he smiled at her slightly. One of his hands released hers as it came up instead to rub up along the length of her arm. You'll need to stay away from the outdoors anyway. Now that Beck has Edith, he'll have the capability to track you with facial recognition. At this, Mary Jane's face crumbled with even more disappointment as she sighed. And Peter knew why. She hated the idea of being confined to the indoors again. Peter hated himself for having to ask it of her. But it was yet another necessity. At least this time, she would be sitting in the lap of luxury rather than a damp basement room, all courtesy of the Osbornes. Staying inside won't do much good if she travels from the airport to Harry's place in London, Michelle pointed out, and Peter had to concede that she had a point. He twisted his lips and thought, trying to brainstorm, before he looked down at Mary Jane's sweet face. Knowing that for the time of the trip to London, she would have to cover those beautiful features up. You'll have to wear sunglasses and a big floppy hat or something. He waited for her confirmation to this plan, and as soon as he got a nod from her, Peter stepped back and wandered over to the bed as he began to strip his shirt, discarding it within seconds before he made to work on his pants, but the tiniest gasp from near the door stopped him and his head snapped up. Michelle and Mary Jane were staring at him, specifically at his naked chest, wide-eyed. Peter let out a little awkward noise, garnering their attention and snapping them out of their dazes. Jumping to attention, Michelle immediately turned around to give him privacy. But Mary Jane did no such thing. Instead, she continued to let her gaze roam as her eyes lingered on his bare chest. Her gaze was heated as she raised her brows at him, urging him silently to continue with the removal of his pants. Mary Jane. Peter whined. Now was not the time. Seriously, why couldn't this sort of thing happen when they were alone and there wasn't a villainous fiend out there that needed capture? If such an occurrence were to ever arise, Peter would have gladly taken advantage of the opening she was freely giving and would have shucked his jeans so quickly that she wouldn't even have to think to ask twice. Rolling her eyes at him, Mary Jane let out a heavy sigh before turning around herself, giving him a modicum of privacy. Peter made quick work of stepping out of his jeans before he donned his spider suit, tapping the spider emblem to tighten the fabric around his form. Okay, Peter said, and both girls turned fully around. But Peter was perplexed to see Mary Jane outright glaring at Michelle as her arms crossed over her chest, which Michelle pointedly ignoring the look as she gave all of her focus on Peter and what his next ideas for what the plan would be. It was odd, seeing Mary Jane acting so coldly to another person outright. But he didn't have time to dissect that with her. There were more pressing matters, like getting to Berlin and warning Fury as soon as possible. Sensing a new presence, Michelle turned toward the still open door. Ned stood there, gaping at the sight in front of his eyes, with Peter in his spider suit and his face still bare of his mask while in the presence of Michelle, who before tonight hadn't fully known the truth of his secret. Still, Peter beamed at the sight of him, glad to see his friend again before he had to rush off. Oh. Ned. Perfect. Ned's gaze shifted between the three of them before they landed on Peter in his spider suit again. The costume looks great. The for the costume party. At the prince's castle. She knows, Peter interjected as he pointed one finger at Michelle while the other donned his mask over his head. I told her. Michelle sent a brief pointed glare Peter's way before she turned to meet Ned's shocked gaze. He didn't tell me. I figured it out. Well, I found out first, Mary Jane muttered out with a huff, crossing her arms again. There was a sour expression on her face and Peter couldn't help but frown at her. He couldn't deny that he was concerned and he wished for more than anything that he had the time to pull Mary Jane aside to have one of those long talks, where she would disclose exactly what it was that was bothering her. Perhaps for now he would only be left guessing until he could return to her side. Or maybe that was it? She was bitter about the fact that he had to leave soon? Oh, that's cool. Ned beamed at Michelle, not hearing Mary Jane's comment in the slightest. Like a long time ago, Michelle said pointedly with a glance toward Mary Jane. His girlfriend's expression became even more discontented. Oh, Ned commented flatly, obviously sensing the same tension in the room that Peter did, but was just as confounded by it as he was. Shaking his head, Peter decided to intervene, needing to remain focused on what was most important here. Look, Mysterio's a fraud, Peter said, jumping right into things as he informed Ned the abbreviated account of the events. Ned frowned, clearly not quite understanding. But he saved Betty and I? No, he's been faking the whole thing with illusion tech, Michelle piped up. Yeah, he's been using these, hologram projectors, Peter confirmed with a nod of his head, still not quite able to grasp the sort of man that Beck ended up being. It was still so bizarre to him, simply because of how nice the man had been to him at times. Whoa, Ned blinked rapidly as he processed this new information. That's crazy. Yeah, Michelle said with a nod, and Ned looked back and forth between Michelle and Peter. So are you guys working the case together or what? With a roll of her eyes, Mary Jane let out a scoff as she shook her head at this notion. Peter's got it handled on his own. But Michelle ignored the comment and looked at Ned before saying, it's been mostly me. Sputtering, Mary Jane opened her mouth to interject, but Peter knew that he was quickly losing time. So as much as he hated to do it, he interrupted Mary Jane before she really got herself going. Look, Ned, I need for you to help cover with Harry, all right? Mary Jane is now coming to London with you guys until all of this blows over. Sensing that he was going to be taking his leave soon, Mary Jane dropped her arms from where they were crossed over her chest as an anxious expression marred her features. Then, taking deliberate steps closer, Mary Jane didn't stop until she had her arms wrapped around his torso. Her closeness was a comfort to him. But it also added to the uneasy feeling in his chest, knowing that they were now saying goodbye. I don't want you to go, Mary Jane said as her fists clenched at the fabric at the back of his suit. We only just found each other again and… I know, Peter said, his voice pained as he held her as close as he dared, not even caring that they had an audience to their emotional farewell. His voice was thick with a threat of tears with his next words, knowing that he was hurting her by leaving her. Hell, he was breaking his promise to her by leaving her, something that he swore that he would never do. And yet, she was being so understanding when she had every right to be angry at him for this. He swallowed against the tight feeling in his throat as he said, but I have to, Red. I made this mess. It's my responsibility. Leaning her forehead against his chest, she nodded against his spider emblem, before muttering out a muffled, I know. She wasn't letting him see her eyes at the moment, and Peter suspected that she didn't want him to see the unshed tears swimming in her eyes. But Peter hardly cared about that. All he wanted now was to see those gorgeous green irises peering up at him, anchoring in his mind as they reminded him what mattered to him most. So, Peter reached down and tucked his finger under her chin and brought her face upward. His suspicions had been correct when he spotted the redness there, which made the green color stand out so brilliantly. Hey, Peter soothed, trying to coax her out of her melancholy with his soft voice, you're my strong, brave girl, all right? I know you can do this. It told him everything that he needed to know about her strength just from the simple fact that there was no panic attack in sight, even with her knowledge of his near departure. She has already come so far in less than a week. He was so proud of her. It's not me that I'm worried about, Tiger. She finally said before she sighed and lifted one of her hands to run her pointer finger along the spider symbol on his chest. Her finger danced there for a few seconds before it paused, and she looked up to meet his eye lenses again. Just please make sure you stay safe, all right? Throat tightening again, all that Peter could manage was a staggered nod. Mary Jane gave him a firm nod in return before she reached upward, rolling up his mask so that his mouth was free from its confines for her to kiss. Her lips were almost bruising against his as they collided. It was almost as though she was trying her best to get as close to him as possible for the several seconds of selfish desire that they allowed themselves. But it was over too soon as she pulled away, reaching up to tug down the rough fabric so that it was secure over his face again. Stepping back, Peter released a shaky breath as he found himself once again trying to memorize her figure for the second time in the matter of hours. At least this time the lighting was better than it had been in the alleyway outside. Stepping back further, he tore open the curtains again, about to rush out the window. Gotta go, wait. Michelle called out, as she rushed forward and tossed an object at him that he easily caught in one hand, the projector. You're gonna need it. Peter nodded and looked at them all, two friends and his girlfriend that were all privy to his secret, as they stared at him right back with a mixture of awe and fear. Don't tell anyone about this, okay? Anyone who knows is in danger, he couldn't help but say as a parting goodbye before he forced himself to take the plunge and finally leave, fearing that if he lingered a moment longer, he would end up changing his mind. Taking a giant leap out the window, Peter released a web, swinging out into the early morning as the sun started to creep up in the horizon, greeting them with the orange glow of dawn. Now the madness really begins. I know that some of you are disappointed because you wanted me to extend Mysterio's secret of villain status for a while longer, but I'm kinda ready to move on from this storyline and am anxious to get back to New York. There will be a lot of fun things that will happen that I have planned, a lot of which you won't be able to guess as most of it will be original as it fills in the gaps between the movies. As much as I love FFH, we all know the story, right? I miss leaving you guys in suspense with my heinous cliffhangers. Don't you guys miss those days? Anyway, please leave a comment on what you thought for this chapter. Thanks so much for reading. I appreciate you all so much.